Welcome to LC Screen Talk. My name is Larry, and today I'm talking about movie villains with a very special guest. So, I would like you all to help me introduce someone you probably already know, Sean Chandler from Sean Chandler Talks About. Hi, Sean. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, thanks so much for inviting me to talk about movie villains. Those are always fun dive into this one.
Yes, villains often talked about, I feel like, easy to overlook, but also easy to criticize.
Yep.
I got this idea kind of earlier this year after How to Train Your Dragon 3, because with that film, a big criticism was the villain. And I had noticed with the How to Train Your Dragon series at large, a big criticism has been the villain. Many of us love superheroes and we're big fans of the MCU. A nagging criticism? The villains! But when they get it done right, like many of the ladies on my shirt, I'd say, Disney knows how to make a pretty good villain pretty often in their animated films. Villains can be the standouts. They can be these iconic figures. So how do you get to that status? So I asked Sean if he would like to come on over, talk about some of our favorite movie villains, why they are, and what is it? What makes a good movie villain? And why are studios and screenwriters struggling so much to get the formula right? So, Sean, I'll let you kick off. Who are some of your favorite movie villains?
So, some of the ones that immediately come to mind, if you're going action movies, Hans Gruber from Die Hard as the heist terrorist guy with the big personality. Naturally, you go with the world of Batman to the Joker, this guy that's this agent of chaos, and depending on the version, very unclear backstory and no real motive in mind. Darth Vader, of course, classic movie villain, but you look at the original Star Wars, 11 minutes of screen time, and we don't really know all that much about him. And so Thanos in the MCU is this character that they slowly teased us who he was, and then they finally revealed him, gave us a movie where he was the person that got kind of the most character development as to why he was this maniac that with this plan, but in a way that went, okay, something drove him to be this crazy person. But if you look at that list, it's interesting because there's not a bunch of common themes inside of it. Like you look at him and you're like, sometimes you get a big backstory, and sometimes it's the Joker, and the part of the gimmick is he gives 5 backstories. So it's been interesting as I was kind of thinking through this one of how different villains can be and how different stories require different things from the villain.
I completely agree. And as I was mentioning those movies earlier, they're vastly different, and you either succeed or you fail in these genres. And it's interesting to think about what does each genre require of their villains, because I think the success rate of villainry varies pretty greatly, actually, when you jump across genres. Obviously, a horror film's villain and a PG animated movie cannot have the same type of villain to succeed. Have to be vastly different. But
even as an interesting one, that I saw have you seen Aladdin yet, the new one? So like one of the things about in the story of the animated or in both versions is Jafar wanting to marry Jasmine, which in and of itself, as soon as you think about it, you go, ooh, that doesn't work. But like they had to like make her older and him younger, because otherwise you do that live action. Just same exact story. You do what they did in the original one live action, and you have the creepiest movie ever made. It's for children. But somehow, like, because it's animated, you kind of like overlook the fact that this 65-year-old man is trying to marry a 15-year-old girl in a G-rated movie.
Also, with the original Aladdin, a different conversation for a different day. They make it pretty ambiguous through animation just how old Jasmine is.
Right.
They make her look like a regular full-bodied woman, like grown adult, at least young woman. So it's easier to fudge that in animation. In live action, we gotta age her up a little bit, please. The movie would have got skewered. Disney, no, please. So yeah, I definitely agree with you. Obviously, those are some of the most iconic villains in history. Obviously, Vader is probably the number one. He's like the most iconic movie villain of all time. I actually looked. USA Today did a ranking based on a bunch of different factors, but of the most popular movie villains of all time, Darth Vader came in at number one because obviously we all love Star Wars. We all love that original trilogy, and he's just such a menacing fact. So you mentioned it. He has very little screen time in the first, and actually throughout the entire original trilogy, he has just about 37 minutes of screen time total across 3 films. Yeah. So even as we expand and we learn more about his character, he has those moments with Luke in the third one, still isn't on screen actually all that much. So what is it to you? Why do you think Darth Vader is this iconic villain?
I think some of it, speaking of genres, this is space fantasy. And so then you have this guy that just looks physically imposing, menacing. Right out of the gate, you see his minions blow away a bunch of guys, and then he just walks in, towering over everyone, picks a guy up with one hand, and just speaks and commands respect. And there's certainly a sense of mystery about him immediately, in that, like, what am I looking at that this guy's so powerful? Then you have this meeting, not too far into the movie, where all these Imperial guys sit around a table, and he starts talking about the power of the Force. Everyone else is just a normal guy. Like, they're just sitting there. And then you have this big guy in a black robot suit, and he puts out his hand and starts showing people. There's just this aura of intrigue surrounding. Because, in that movie, you get a little bit of his backstory from Obi-Wan. Kind of hints at some things to Luke. And then you get this battle with Obi-Wan at the end of it, where you get just little teases, these lines that we know what they mean now, but at the time, were just these vague ideas of who is this guy? Like, he used to be with Obi-Wan. They used to be on the same side. And so he was so powerful because he was powerful just in general, but then you don't know what happened. Who is he? That sense of mystery surrounding who he was. And then as you go through the rest of the films, they play that out for us. They tell us what it is. And with fantasy, you want some of those, Joseph Campbell hero's journey type elements to it, where everything kind of ties together and father wounds and all kinds of different psychological things tie into it that kind of give it a deeper emotional and relational strength to it. So you start off with just power, intrigue, and then you give answers that were satisfying, at least in the original trilogy. Maybe not so much in the prequels, where it's like answering, what did he do as a kid? He built C-3PO. Like, I don't think I wanted to know that's what Darth Vader did.
No, not really. But I think it's a very interesting point. We do, for me, I think Darth Vader, and to a certain extent, as an extension, Palpatine throughout the original, the Emperor, although they don't have much screen time, they, especially Vader, becomes such a presence when he does come on screen. It's like a looming darkness over the entirety of the original. Like, he may not be on screen, but everything that's happening is kind of surrounding Vader. Like, we have to get up there. We have to defeat this thing. Mm-hmm. How are we going to defeat this crazy robot man thing that's plaguing the universe? And he kills Obi-Wan. He kills, our main mentor in the first film. Of course, mm-hmm. Obi-Wan kind of gives himself up, but that adds more intrigue. But he kills someone that you kind of set up and presume is going to be a main factor in the film, and moving forward, you would have assumed a mentor role moving on through all of them. And then, what so many don't get is a redemption arc. Darth Vader is one of the few villains who comes full circle by the end of that final trilogy. Again, the prequels, we're not going to talk about that. They have villains all of their own. Yeah, we don't get to see villains actually redeem themselves by the end. We have this kind of prophecy in place for Vader that is fulfilled, and that as much as people want to like shock audiences or surprise audiences, we do that. We get the revelation that he's Luke's father. We also want prophecies that find their way home, that actually mean something. And I think that's a big thing with Vader, is he actually does something that means something, and everybody loves a redemption arc, like, you know.
Well, and even the flip side to that, the some of what makes it so powerful is, you know, the execution of the fall of Anakin. Of course, we probably have issues with it, but the idea of the fall of Anakin is also what makes him such a compelling villain, because it's like, how do you go from the hero of the Jedi Order to the primary enemy of the Jedi? And that's what makes the redemptive arc so powerful, and the way that they slowly unraveled the details about all of it, so that all of it's potent at each stage in different ways, leading to redemption that actually matters.
Yeah, certainly. That's why I think even after we've had the prequels, Darth Vader continues to be, if not the, one of the top, like, most popular movie villains of all time. The prequels didn't drag the character of Darth Vader down, even though it gave us some insight into things we didn't need to know. The story was there. George Lucas had problems with the execution, but he had the bare bones of a story that still rang true with us as an audience.
I think because I can just write off the prequels to some extent, but the thing that I think they did that was most damaging, it's not Jar Jar Binks, it's not, you know, pining over sand and stuff like that, but it's that the way that he converts from Anakin to Darth Vader is he's fooled. He's tricked. Which it makes Darth Vader stop being like this true believer of this cause that we need an empire, which is interesting in its own way, to, he was duped into thinking he was going to save his wife, and then he actually, like, that makes him look silly and foolish. Like, he's less interesting now that he's a dummy, that he went from like, I need to save my wife. Just kidding, I need to go kill kids. Like, that makes him not nearly as good of a villain to me.
I would agree with that as well. So I actually asked the question, who are your favorite movie villains, on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and Sammy from Sammy One World said Darth Vader without question, because of his moral conflicts and how menacing and threatening he is, which is a great start. But as we've seen right there in Star Wars, looking cool and feeling menacing can only get you so far as a top-notch villain. So why do you think villains like Boba Fett and Darth Maul kind of still stand the test of time? Because people have always had this like weird clamoring to love them, even though they just never reach their potential.
There's like no character there. I mean,
there's nothing.
Both of them, I think it is kind of the fact that there's not really a character there. They're mysterious. It's just like, who's this guy that Han Solo is scared of? Who's this guy that like is taking on 2 Jedi out of nowhere? Like he's so powerful, and as soon as we get to see what he can do as a fighter, then he's, you know, killed / not killed, obviously, but we wanted to bring it back.
We now realize what an awesome villain we had on our hands.
But then likewise, Boba Fett's a lot more interesting to me when he's not the first of the clones. When he's this bounty hunter that we don't know where he came from. That we just know that Han Solo knows who he is, and he's kind of scared of him. And he's the guy that tracked him down. But suddenly when it's like he's so intertwined with everything, it's like, okay, this just seems convoluted and kind of goofy, that this is... Like, wait, are all the stormtroopers, are they clones too, or did they get a new batch of people? Like, what? How does this even tie all together? Like, why is he so different than all the other clones? I don't understand. And so I think it's that mystery surrounding them, they look cool, but then not knowing much more about them is what initially made them interesting characters.
So the Joker is one that you had mentioned earlier on in the video. The Joker is another one. Just looking over some lists, I obviously went to places like Empire Magazine, Hollywood Reporter, Screen Rant to see what kind of lists they had. Darth Vader was 1 or 2 on literally all of those lists. Another one that made it onto all of the lists was the Joker. Most people specifically referenced Heath Ledger's version of the Joker. With the Joker, is it more of the character? Or do you think the portrayal and the way that they are executed has a a large effect on the success of the character, from like page to screen?
I think there is a side to it of there have been, I think there's been 4 different iconic Jokers. Cesar Romero, Jack Nicholson, Mark Hamill, Heath Ledger. Jared Leto, not so much.
He's and there.
But like they're ones that they really have kind of gotten some really good performances, and they're all totally different. Yeah. And it's a character that, the Jack Nicholson one, they do kind of give him a backstory and tie it into Batman probably a little bit too much. But the other ones, he's just kind of this agent of chaos that you don't know too much about who he is, where he came from. And he's the opposite of our character. Our lead character comes from tragedy and wants to turn that into bringing order. He wants to make things less chaotic so that people don't experience the trauma that he had, whereas the Joker just wants chaos. There's no real end goal. There's no like, I want to be this, I want this. He's just out there to burn it all down. And in and of itself, that just opposite to the character, our lead character, makes for this balanced story or balanced conflict.
That brings a threat all into itself as well that not a lot of other villains really have. It's just this insane unpredictability of the Joker. It's just, he's one villain that literally anything could come at any time from anywhere. You wouldn't be shocked because of who that character is. But it also is like, it's not necessarily physical threats. It's much more of a psychological warfare with the Joker that I think is really interesting. And that really differentiates him from pretty much every other superhero villain I think we've gotten to the screen. I don't think we have another villain that just is crazy. Even the other iconic villains like Thanos, there's a reason. He has a very clear purpose. He has a very clear reason. But as successful as he is, it's a different kind of success. Eric Killmonger was another MCU villain I think we all thought was pretty good. Right. He had a very clear mindset of why. With this character, I mean, it's just like, what is going on? He's crazy. But with the MCU, who is your favorite MCU villain?
I've been good. Thanos. I've enjoyed Thanos.
Yeah. Is there a specific reason he stands above the Lokis and the Killmongers of the world?
I mean, those are, I think, that my top 3 or 3 of my top 4, something like that. So that's my list right there. And I also enjoy Vulture. And they're all very different if you look at those 4. But for me with Thanos, I just thought it was like with Loki. He used to be my number 1, but he also does a little bit of the kind of the in and out of anti-hero story of redemption. He's the villain of Avengers, but it even seems a little, how far he goes in trying to kill New York seems a little out of character, perhaps. But with Thanos, it's kind of like you have the guy that has this long-term plan that he's a true believer in. Something happened to him that kind of drove him to this insane worldview where he believes, I'm going to be the person to save the universe by burning half of it down. And just in and of itself, that's pretty powerful. But then in Infinity War, they have all these little moments where you realize, he actually, really does care about Gamora. He has aches and pains inside of this to accomplish this goal that's we don't really like it. I don't agree with his strategy, but he does. And that's what's so compelling about it. And, can contrast that with, you say, the Joker. There's nothing that he believes in at all. And so you just look at it and you go, that's such polar opposites of villains, but compelling in their own ways.
As you were talking about it, another one of my favorite superhero villains is Magneto. And talking about Loki and Thanos, I think he's kind of a blend of the two. He has a very clear set of how he wants mutants to be safe. It is just his ideology on how we go about making mutant kind not be ostracized from humanity. It's a very violent, murderous way of trying to go about it, but he is doing what he thinks is best to get to a better world. But he's another character that I think really goes in and out of redemptions very well. I think they do a really good job, even in the films, in the lesser successful X-Men films up to the best of the X-Men films. I think they've always done a pretty good job. Part of that is because Ian McKellen and Michael Fassbender both kill it in the role. But I've always thought they've done a pretty good job of Magneto. Do you have any thoughts on Magneto or the X-Men villains at large, I guess, to fold them in?
Yeah, I mean, I think Magneto would pretty easily be the best of the X-Men villains in the films. And, I mean, in the comics, of course, he's also established to be kind of the intended to be that, the balance in there as well. But yeah, and talking about what we've kind of alluded to before of one of the things that can make for a great villain is being that balance to the hero of you have Charles Xavier, you got Magneto, and one of them is raised a nice, healthy, privileged lifestyle, and the other one has this horrible life of tragedy, and so much of the tragedy comes from the fact that he's a mutant. The other doesn't have that at all. And they come out of that with two different worldviews. One has seen the best of mankind, and the other has seen the worst of mankind. And they're still buddies. They still want what's best for mutants, and they just see two very different ways to get there. And one can justify very evil actions because very evil things have been done to him, and he keeps seeing very evil things being done. And you go, okay, I don't think you should do what you're doing, but I can see why you think that.
Certainly. And I think, obviously, superheroes are an easy one because they have a pretty clear cut, this is our villain most of the time. There is a set-up villain for our heroes to overcome or to defeat. What do you think are the circumstances in which we don't really need a villain? Or are there circumstances? Is a villain required for a film to be successful?
I think normally you need some sort of human threat. Some sort of, you think all stories, they can be told. There's exceptions to that. But you even think through a lot of disaster movies. I watched the movie Twister last week.
Yes.
And even in this movie that's all about tornadoes. Tornadoes are the threat. It's man against nature. They still add the Carrie Elwes character into it as this guy that's the evil, selfish tornado chaser. And so just something about you want some human in the mix that's making a choice that's bad, or some conflict between people just to add that spice into it. You think that even most disaster movies, they throw that guy into it that's the overconfident guy. Now I'm thinking of the movie Daylight. It's about a tunnel that collapses and people are stuck underground, and Sylvester Stallone has to go and get everybody out. They throw into the mix Viggo Mortensen as this overconfident adventurer that's stuck under the ground, and he kind of is leading people astray because he thinks that he has everything resolved, and he's not listening. So that even in a movie where the tunnel collapsing, that's the villain, you throw those people in there to add that extra mix. But I was thinking through this one of what are some of the movies that even had a conflict where, Captain America Civil War, the most interesting conflict in that, the title conflict, doesn't really require a villain.
No, yeah.
Zemo ties in, and I think Zemo is more even used basically because they wanted to get the story to a certain plot point.
He's a catalyst,
at the end of it. Yeah, he's the person that brings all these pieces together. But if you just want the Civil War, the competing ideologies of two heroes is what causes that. Likewise, a lot of the tension, I was thinking about Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, and a lot of the tension inside of that story is just apes want to survive and humans want to survive, and they don't trust each other. Yeah. Now, Koba and later in the film does totally become a villain, but before that, there's tension without needing to have Gary Oldman's not the bad guy of the film. He just doesn't want his people to die. So he does things in the movie that are very bad for Caesar and the Apes, but he's not in any way motivated by actual evil at all. It's 100%, he screams I'm just trying to save the human race. And he is. Yeah. And that's like, I think those could be really, that's the stuff that has the deepest kind of hits for me of when you can find a way where nobody's really fully wrong. Yeah. It's that the realities of life, that life is complex and we end up on different sides to it. And when miscommunications happen in tense situations, Gary Oldman starts blowing up apes.
Yeah, I fully agree. Those are some of my favorite stories, is what I kind of noticed as I started thinking about villains. I was like, the ones that oftentimes hit me the hardest are the ones that don't have at least a super obvious villain. It comes more from circumstance. It comes more from the story itself having to play out in a way that, you get these two sides at odds, but it doesn't necessarily mean, as you said, one is right, one is wrong. It's just kind of as we were talking about with someone like Thanos or Magneto, if they were given more actual humanity and a little bit less crazy, it could be something of like, overpopulation is bad. How do we solve this? And if you give the person wanting to kill people just a little bit of like extra humanity, suddenly it becomes much more of a like, of course, killing people is always going to be a hard sell. It's going to be a hard sell to not become a villain. But I think those are the kind of situations that really get to me. I also think some adventures, they can have a villain. A lot of times, if those villains get pushed to the background, I notice I don't mind as much. So one of my favorite, I've talked a lot about animation, and I love animation, and that's really a catalyst of this. I talked about How to Train Your Dragon, and another one is Moana for me, that really got criticized for the lack of a villain. It didn't really have a villain. It had the woman, and now I'm completely Tafiti, I think is her name, who had kind of lost it, but she wasn't fully a villain. I mean, they had to go to defeat this, but it was much more about like the hero's journey, and it was more about her overcoming things, and overcoming conflicts was the main conflict of the story. I think of especially the first How to Train Your Dragon. We get that big dragon that comes in at the very end that is forcing the little dragons to feed it to get like this fight at the end. But honestly, most of the movie, the story we're being told is ideologies. It's a father and a son having two conflicting ideologies. It's another situation. Neither one of them are wrong. They are both just doing what they think is best and trying to convince the other that they're right and what they're doing is right. Forbidden friendship. And I think oftentimes the movies get it feels like criticism just goes to like, oh, well, you just plugged a dragon in at the end and called it your villain. And that might be a criticism in the fact that why even have this dragon, maybe. But also, I think sometimes we get hung up on villains and maybe them being strong. As we talked about, you don't necessarily need screen time to make a villain strong. You don't even necessarily need to have a backstory, because if you're going to do that, then it has to be something like Infinity War, where they get a lot of screen time and you really are dedicated to pretty much making it their story. And that only really works to put your heroes on the periphery if you've had 10 years to already build up the heroes. It's so much harder to do that in a 2-hour movie, to throw your heroes to the periphery to focus on the villain. Nobody would really like that, I don't think. That's not really what we're looking for either. So somebody that they've really talked about on the list, on all the social media, is Hannibal Lecter. Somebody who doesn't have almost any screen time. I think they've clocked it somewhere around 15 minutes or so in the entire film is all that Hannibal Lecter really does. I guess this kind of segues us into horror a little bit. The horror genre and what makes them good villains. Hannibal Lecter being the beacon that made all the lists, all the social media, people throwing him out as the best villain of all time. What works with Hannibal Lecter?
I just think it's this... They crafted such an interesting personality and intelligence that he doesn't need a lot of screen time, because every line of dialogue he says just like sticks with you and like catches your attention, and he just kind of like digs his claws into Clarice just like immediately, and just in a way that you're like, this is unsettling what he's able to do here, and that's just immediately interesting. And then you add to the mix that he's fascinated by her, and you don't know why. You don't know what it is that makes him like suddenly he's gonna like work with her, and you don't know like where's he headed in all this. What's his motivation inside of all of it? You just know that you just can't get enough of this personality and intellect.
Yeah, I think kind of how we were talking about with Vader. It's another villain that, as you said, he sticks to your own psyche, but he's also pretty omnipresent throughout the film. He doesn't have a lot of screen time. He makes use of that screen time. Anthony Hopkins makes sure to steal every single scene he's in.
And like Vader, I mean, he just commands the screen.
Yeah.
Immediately, you know he's the dominant personality, but in a totally opposite way.
Yeah.
Like he is not 7 foot tall David Prowse in a black robot suit.
Yeah.
He's a guy in a cell and still commands everything.
As you said, I mean, he's so enticing to the viewer in such a weird kind of strange way. You're like, what? Oh, but I can't. Like, I'm intoxicated by what's going on as well. I can't get enough of it.
Did you catch the Zac Efron Ted Bundy movie? Can't remember the name because it's really long.
Extremely wicked, evil. Yeah.
One of the things about it that's some people have said is a negative, and I thought was great about it, is that he has a little bit of the Hannibal Lecter vibe to him of that he's this guy that's charismatic, and you're like enticed by this personality that he has, and then you're like, oh wait, Ted Bundy's not Hannibal Lecter. He's like a real guy. Like, oh my goodness. Like, I was almost rooting for this guy for a second, even though I know that it's gross, but it's whatever that thing that the actual human Ted Bundy had of being this person that could just draw you in. That's what they kind of channeled with Hannibal Lecter in its own way.
Then let's take a look at Sci-Fi, another one that I think we're all pretty enthusiastic about. And it kind of brushes in and out. So what villains of Sci-Fi stand out to you as some of the strongest of the crop?
So I'm a Star Trek guy, so okay. I would have to go with Khan from Wrath of Khan. Have you seen it?
I've seen Wrath of Khan. I'm not a big Star Trek person in general, though. I'm sorry to say.
And so then the one with him is that it's a sequel to an episode of the TV show. It's a good episode of the show, but it doesn't immediately strike you as like they're gonna make this awesome movie about it. The episode ended somewhere that could create a scenario where someone would just be this brilliant guy that is out for revenge. And even though he's smarter than the crew of the Enterprise, he's so driven by rage that he's making foolish emotional decisions, and he also isn't used to the universe. And so even though and they use all of those elements, and so the crew, like each side has its strengths and weaknesses as to how all the pieces kind of play together. And it's just all really powerful in the way it plays out because they used the villain as the balance to our heroes.
I mean, I would go along with that. I haven't seen much of Star Trek. I have seen Wrath of Khan. It's been quite some time, and not one I've really rewatched.
It's one of those, like, you either love a bunch of that Star Trek stuff, you're like, okay, what are people seeing in this one?
I do have to say, sci-fi is always a little bit of a hard one. So is fantasy to a certain extent, because so often they overcross with other genres. It's so rare to find just a straight up science, like sci-fi, science fiction, what we would classify. It's always kind of overlaid with something else that makes it sci-fi. And I mean, of course, that goes back to Star Wars, sci-fi versus fantasy. Is it both? Is it all that foolishness. But with something that is intellectually based, and you just mentioned it with Khan from Wrath of Khan, do you think that a sci-fi villain has to inherently be intelligent? Has to really play off of that intelligence factor as part of their villainy? Be successful, I guess I'd say.
I mean, I wouldn't want to say have to, because I'm sure you could find some counterexample. But you have to find, I think that you probably do need to have a certain level of that has to tie into it, whether it's not intelligent, but it's just a primal evil, just some creature that's the opposite of our technology-based people, and that's what makes it interesting, is that it doesn't have all the smarts and gadgets of our heroes. But I'd have to think about that one. Think through my sci-fi villains.
Your sci-fi repertoire.
I guess actually. example of that would be the Alien movies, the Xenomorphs.
That's kind of what I thought too.
No personality at all.
Yeah.
No deeper intelligence, but we like at the same time they're on ships that are ending up places. I don't know, is that how much is them and how much that's they just got on the ships, but that's kind of the scary nature of it is that they've got machine guns, they got flamethrowers, they got spaceships, and then there's just these creatures in the dark that are still more powerful.
Yeah, and that's another perfect example of sci-fi just crossing over with something else, because it seems to be what happens. But we talked about Hannibal Lecter as a horror villain. I would say horror psychological drama, Silence of the Lambs. Do you think horror films and those villains, do they have to get some kills? Or do we get villains where they can just be intimidating or creepy, kind of, I guess, paranormal, but even these paranormal activity villains get kills by the end of them. Does a horror film have to kill somebody to be a successful villain? Or can it just be creepy?
I mean, I think they have to do something that just is diabolical. Because you think even the possession ones, they're not necessarily killing anyone. They might not die. But the idea that you've taken someone's autonomy of themselves away, and you're possessing them, and creepiness of that, like they're not killing them, but that is evil, evil. Yeah. And so I think there's something really powerful in that but you have to have something that just makes you go, oh. And that's what like a lot of horror movies. There's not like a deep motivation driving them. That's not, that Jason Voorhees does not, like, well, what he really wants is to, he's just drugs and premarital sex. He just thinks that they're evil, and so he wants to eliminate to get people, I mean.
You weren't watching me! Die!
It doesn't, there's not like this deep reason to it, but this force of evil doing or killing people, and, seems to be what is the driving force of a lot of horror films. And so I think you have to have something evil to make that compelling.
And I think actually the reverse is true for horror in a lot of cases than it is with, say, a comic book hero, where I think most of the time, other than maybe the Joker, we like to be able to sympathize to some extent. We like to be able to understand these comic book heroes. Whereas horror, these prequels, maybe if they had been done better, it could have turned out different. But these remakes have shown we don't necessarily want. I don't want to know why Freddy Krueger is doing what he's doing. I don't want to know why Michael Myers. I don't need to know his abusive, rape-filled, like all of that. It's like, gosh, no, this is all way worse for it. Like. And I think it's that inherent evil, is that so often with horror, you want to be scared by this evilness. And if we start to throw in, like, well, they were abused as a kid, or they were this, or they were that, that works for, again, something more along, like, psychological thriller horror, but, like, slasher films. And you don't need all that. We don't want that. We don't want complexity, and too much complexity in our horror films.
Right. And, I mean, I think they're the embodiment of evil and what our fears are. Like, our fear is that there are people out there that are just nuts. Yeah. There's stuff out there that's just dangerous, and there's no reason behind it. Yeah. That's what makes so much of this terrifying. Whereas, like, in a superhero story, you want someone that's trying to do something that's interesting as to why you're trying to stop them. If you're just trying to scare me, a nutbar's out there killing people for no reason. Yeah, that's what's scary.
I always have loved the ending of The Strangers when they ask them, "Why did you do this?" And they're just like, "'Cause you were home." Like, that's like, oh my gosh, there's plenty of people that are like that. Again, thank you so much, Sean. Do you have any further thoughts about villains? What makes us gravitate toward them? What makes us put them on shirts, even though they're the bad guy we're rooting against for so much of the film?
I think that there's a side to it that they just get to have more fun. Some of them do, because there's no rules. Hans Gruber, I mentioned it at the beginning. We didn't get head in that direction too much, but it's Alan Rickman as this guy that gets to go full fun Alan Rickman, And if he just wants to like shoot people, he can shoot people. There's no limits to it. And there's something about that that's fun and compelling in its own way. Or when you have someone like a Loki that's mischievous and goes from side to side, and that's something that we get to indulge in. Something, I don't want to kill a bunch of people, but there's something about that that's tantalizing in its own way. Or what if I just kind of head in the wrong direction? What if I'd had the wrong path? Or Killmonger, we touched on him a little bit of, you know, he's this person that, you know, has all the skill set potential to be this great positive leader, but he's grown up in such a world of pain that he sees it through this skewed perspective. But it's this skewed perspective that has this kernel of truth inside of it. So that's interesting of like, okay, what if you had the right goal, but you were so broken yourself that the way you wanted to get there was just evil? Or that's which is kind of somewhat the Thanos too, of like, that's interesting in its own way of, whereas the Captain America can be dull because it's like, he's a good guy. he doesn't like bullies. Wow, that's good. You don't like bullies. That's
you go, Cap.
And you know, I pick on him a little bit, but you know, there's such a simplicity of goodness to that, to where you contrast that with a Killmonger of just a very complex worldview of someone that absolutely wants to do something so obviously evil, while fully believing, yeah, I'm helping all these people out. Like these people have oppressed them. I'm going to defeat the oppressors. Yeah. There's good things inside of that.
Certainly, and I think that's why the MCU has waned in and out. They figured out Captain America, we got to put him in interesting situations. Let's bring back his old friend. Let's pit him against Iron Man. So they got to do that. But then we get stuff like Dark Elves, and they just don't understand what a good villain is.
They don't even have a personality. Like Mel
They're
Gibson
just
doesn't even have a personality.
Yeah. And then I definitely agree. Some of my favorite villains, again, we didn't talk about them too much. I talked about animation a little bit. I think Disney is a great vehicle for what you just said. They get to have fun. Like the villains, what makes a good Disney villain is a little bit over the top, a little bit of that campiness. They get a good song, and you get to just have fun with this villain. Of course you're mad when Scar kills Mufasa, but yet he's still one of everybody's favorite villains. Yeah. So it's all just very interesting, and I love the villain. If I were an actor, I would love to be hired on as a villain for that purpose, to just be like, oh, yes, I get to chew into this role.
Yes.
So obviously we want to know who some of your favorite villains from film are, and what make good villains in your eyes. Let us know all of that in the comment section down below, or you can hit either of us up on Twitter. So Sean, do you want to tell everyone where they can find you on the internet?
So you can find me on my channel, Sean Chandler Talks About. It's just a place for people that love to talk about movies way too much. I'm on Twitter at Kirk Never Died, Star Trek reference right there, but Kirk Never Died. And then on Instagram, I do a lot of stuff on Instagram. Sean Chandler Talks, I think is what it is. Or Sean Talks About. Oh, I forgot what it is, but I can give it to you so you can put it in the description. But I post a lot of stuff on there. I try to be pretty active and have some fun, cute little things there every day.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for joining me here today, Sean. I highly appreciate it. As he said, all of his links are going to be in the comment section down below. If you did like this video while you're still here, go ahead and click that like button and subscribe to the channel so you are always up to date on our latest videos. I love you all so much for your continued support. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.